Joe.
What?
Rolling.
Brattaloni's Hardware and Garden Stores brings you Garage Logic podcast number 1256. The rare date of Feb 29, 2024. 61 degrees on this day in the year 2000. And it was 10 below on this day in 1884.
Hail the flashlight king.
And now, from the mayor's office above the boathouse on the east shore of Spoon Lake, it's Garage Logic with Chris Reavers manning Technology Corner, Kenny Olson from the Krabby Coffee Shop, John Haidt in the newsroom, and of course, the rookie. Here is your flashlight king, fireworks commissioner, and the keeper of common sense, your mayor, Joe Souchere.
We're joined in the studio by Dan McGrath, who is an election. How did you become an election guru, savant, expert?
Well, it was never my intention. I was hired to do some writing and research at a nonprofit organization called Minnesota Majority back in 2007.
Mm-hmm.
And in the summer of 2008, one of my projects I was working on was just doing survey calls of registered voters on the issues that were important to them for that election year.
Mm-hmm.
Our surveys, our volunteers who were conducting the surveys kept coming up to me after making a call and saying, well, this is weird. They answered the phone and said the guy I'm calling died 10 years ago, but according to the voter registration files that we were using to make the calls, he voted in the last election.
Okay.
So with a large data set like the statewide voter registration system, there are going to be some errors. That just happens.
Right.
It's to be expected. But there were so many of them over the course of this project that we became concerned.
All right. You authored a book called The Voter Fraud Manual.
Yes,
You've contributed to books written by John Fund of the Wall Street Journal, for example.
Yes.
And what, if you had to define what you do for a living, what would it be?
Well, I've been a nonprofit executive. I've been a communications director. Right now, I'm self-employed as far as politics go.
Right.
I run a couple of websites. Everything I'm going to talk about today is available at electionintegritywatch.org. So
okay.
There's documentation of everything I'll discuss right at that website.
And you're a GLer.
Absolutely. I've been listening since the 90s. In fact, this is the first show I ever called for a radio show.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, then you know perfectly well that the GL operating theme, and it needs your clarification. I just think that voting used to be a charming, rock solid demonstration of America when we were either honored or had the privilege to go to the polls and vote, and it was simple. It was understandable. And then something happened. It got all bollocksed up. And to me, it's terribly confusing. And people say, well, all of what's happened has been to make it easier for people to vote, which I've always contested. There are some exceptions, but how easy are you supposed to make it? And that's the GL theory. What the hell happened?
Well, yeah, that's the eternal argument in the election integrity debate is easy to vote or hard to cheat.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's my opinion that you can do both. You can make it easy to vote. It's already easy to vote. You know this. We all know this.
Yeah.
But it's not hard to cheat in Minnesota. And over the years, it wasn't a sudden thing. It's been a gradual encroachment on the integrity of our election system where every single legislative session, the Secretary of State's office usually brings forward a bill that's like a housekeeping bill. Technical changes to keep up with the times, to keep up with new technology that's been introduced or whatever. But in those bills, they always include some way to loosen up some nut or bolt that was put in place to ensure the integrity of our election process.
Mm-hmm.
So gradually over many, many years, ever since Mary Kiffmeyer left the Secretary of State's office and Mark Ritchie was elected, and he was the poster child of George Soros's project, Secretary of State project.
Mm-hmm.
So
what was the purpose of that project by George Soros?
The Secretary of State project, George Soros figured out that it's expensive to run an election campaign for congressmen and senators and for president, but an overlooked office that's in charge of elections is the Secretaries of State's offices across the country. So he funded the election of candidates, very, very progressive candidates in many states, and Mark Ritchie was his first success. So George Soros' money was largely behind putting him in office, and they had an agenda. And the agenda was to loosen up our election system in the way
Why?
that they have progressively done. Well, I believe they think it's to their advantage. I think it's just that simple. So when we were attempting to amend Minnesota's constitution to get voter ID required for everybody to vote.
Right. Tell that story. That's interesting.
Well, what I heard all the time on the campaign trail, trying to get that ratified.
And this is recently. This is
2012.
2012. Dayton was president. I'm sorry. Mark Dayton was governor. Yeah.
Thankfully, he hadn't made it that far.
Dayton
up the
was governor.
Yet. He was. Yes. So we had that year drafted a pretty extensive election reform bill on the Republican side, which usually doesn't happen. Election bills almost always come from the Democrat side.
Right.
But we had an 83-page bill that was designed to introduce a photo ID requirement, along with a lot of updates that would require electronic poll books in the polling place for instant verification of a voter's eligibility and to speed up the lines and the help registration process. Ultimately, it was passed by both chambers of the legislature, but Governor of Dayton vetoed it.
Why?
He said it didn't have broad bipartisan support. Which
sounds like it did.
Well, it didn't.
Okay.
It passed on a pretty much party line vote. We believed we were going to have some Democrats vote for it in the House, but in the end, they got their arms twisted and they didn't end up voting for it. So it was a partisan bill. And the standard at that time had been set by Governor Tim Pawlenty, who said he wouldn't sign any election bill that didn't have broad bipartisan support. So Mark Dayton just echoed those words, and that was his excuse to veto the bill. But we had a majority in the legislature in both the House and the Senate that year. So we were able to get a constitutional amendment put together for the following election cycle in 2012. So we did that. And in the course of that campaign, I kept hearing from the other side that this is a solution in search of a problem. So they're saying, well, you're trying to fix a problem that isn't there. And this is what you're saying about our election systems now, right? It's not broken when they keep trying to fix it.
Yeah, we're fixing something that was never broken.
Well, right. And
if you go back into American history, we can find problems.
Well, I can tell you about a lot of them. Sure.
Right.
And it's not just in history. They're still going on. Some of the more egregious things from the past are being replicated in our modern era. Like Ike Brown, for example, in Mississippi. It's kind of like Boss Hogg from the Dukes of Hazzard, right?
Nice reference. Love it. Let's talk Dukes.
Glad Rookie likes the reference. Any TV pop culture from the 70s and 80s, right?
Yes.
So Boss Hogg, when you watch that show, it looks ridiculous. You couldn't believe that just one guy could be in charge of a whole county and run it in such a corrupt manner. But it happens. It absolutely happens. And that was the case of Ike Brown in Mississippi, who was finally ousted from his position of being in charge of primary elections in Noxubee County after just decades of corruption, where he was placing his men in polling places to provide voter assistance, quote unquote, to people. So he would send his goons into the voting booth with people that came in to make sure they voted the right way.
Where's the fail-safe for that, though? Shouldn't there always be a fail-safe that can't happen?
Well, there should be. And a big part of it is you're supposed to have bipartisan observers in polling places. And in Minnesota, we have had that pretty effectively up until recently. When we have one day of voting, then it's possible for the political parties to get volunteers to go and watch all the polling places. They're called poll challengers. And when you stretch it out over 2 weeks, and you're asking people to volunteer to be at polling places that sometimes are temporary and have different hours, they just pop up randomly, it's impossible to staff these poll challengers in our polling places for early voting. So they've eliminated basically the opportunity for the parties to be observers in the election process.
Let's stick to Minnesota.
Okay.
Is there a problem right now in Minnesota?
Huge problem.
What is it?
So if you just look at the system that we have, that is a combination of no photo ID required,
right,
to register or to vote, and election day registration. You can register to vote on election day in Minnesota.
Why is that a bad thing?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but it's in how you do it.
Okay.
Our state, unlike 44 other states in the country, doesn't use provisional ballots. Now, provisional ballots are required by federal law unless you have a really weird election system in your state, which we do. So we get an exemption from provisional ballots. What those are is a second chance ballot. If you show up and you don't have ID, or you can't prove that you live in the precinct or something like that, the provisional ballot would be a way for you to vote and then have it verified later. So if you can come back later and show ID, then your vote would end up getting counted, but it's set aside until they verify that you are who you say you are and that you're eligible. We don't do that. So with election day registration, there is no way to verify anything about a voter until long after their vote has been cast.
All right.
and
So we have
counted.
same day registration.
We do, and no identification is required to register on election day. All you need is someone to vouch for you. You get someone in the precinct, hey, can you vouch for me?
But
Hey,
the person vouching for you has to demonstrate they're in the precinct.
the person vouching for you has to be registered in that precinct.
All right.
But we've seen this process abused deliberately and on an industrial scale in the past. America Coming Together, Students Organizing for America, the Wellstone Campaign have all been observed planting people in polling places wearing name tags that identify them as someone that will vouch for you.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if I have a part-time job, I work evenings as a chauffeur.
Mm-hmm.
And when I go to the airport and I want to meet somebody, I hold up a sign so they can find me.
Mm-hmm.
But if I know who I'm picking up at the airport, I don't need that sign, do I?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to recognize the person. So why would you need a name tag to identify yourself as a vouch person if you're
Mm-hmm.
vouching for people that you know?
Mm-hmm.
So it becomes pretty obvious there. The scam is they're just going to vouch for strangers, which is illegal. So it's a felony, but these organizations got away with it for decades. Like this, this goes back to at least as far back as Wellstone, probably further, because the system is ripe for abuse when you combine election day registration with vouching. That's where the big problem comes in. Now, I am a person who really likes to have concrete numbers. I like proof. I like evidence.
Mm-hmm.
When people start running around saying, I have absolute proof of a stolen election, you better have some absolute proof.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, I'm going to discount that. After the 2008 election, for example, we obtained a copy of the statewide voter registration system with some additional data and analyzed it and found that over 6,000 election day registrants in that very momentous election when Franken beat Norm Coleman by 312 votes in the end,
Mm-hmm.
6,000 election day registrants provided addresses that didn't check out after the fact.
Mm-hmm.
So they mailed them postcards to verify their address, and they came back as undeliverable mail. We sent volunteers around to go and investigate those properties, and we found parks, warehouses, industrial facilities.
Wow.
They were non-residential addresses in many cases.
Where are you on the Trump belief that the election was rigged for Biden? Where are you on that?
Well, that's where I'm talking about evidence.
Mm-hmm.
I want to see solid evidence. Now, I haven't done
There
the
isn't
research
any.
for a nationwide
Right.
election. But I look at the numbers and I say, is it likely that Joe Biden got more votes for president than anyone in history?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't seem likely.
Mm-hmm.
There's probably some problems there, and I know our elections are holy. There are gaps in the security of our system. So fraud happened.
Mhm.
Sure. How much fraud?
Mm-hmm.
Was there enough fraud to manipulate the results of the Electoral College?
Mm-hmm.
No idea.
Mm-hmm.
And at this point, the amount of research it would take to figure that out with certainty is astronomical. So I would never.
But Dan,
Yeah.
based upon what you've just told us in the first 12 minutes, wouldn't it be safe to assume that it's probably not just happening here? in
No,
Minnesota?
absolutely not. No, it's happening everywhere for sure. But Minnesota's
But
one
based
of the
upon
worst offenders.
the most recent presidential election, I guess is what I was referring to. Would it be a safe assumption to say, because you said the lack of evidence, I guess?
Yeah, what happens in Minnesota certainly is happening elsewhere.
Oh my God.
No question. But we remember we're close to the bottom of the list for election integrity. So some states have much better systems than we have. Now, what I advocate for is replacing our election day registration system with one that uses the computer technology that we now have in a lot of polling places. Have you guys voted with poll books where you just,
Yes.
instead of the old roster books they had to flip through and sign on the line?
That's what I still do.
Really, you
Yeah.
still have a roster? Have you seen the poll
Yeah,
books? Well,
yeah.
okay. Well, electronic poll books are deployed in most places around the state now, and they have the capability of using those. So you can just swipe your ID on it; it'll
Mhm.
validate your identification instantly that it's a real ID.
I don't have that. No.
And it has the capability then of instantly verifying that you're not on any lists of challenged voters, like the people who had their postcards returned as undeliverable. They're put on a list to be challenged for the next election. prior to this past legislative session, if you were convicted of a felony, you were going to be ineligible to vote until you were off paper. So if you were, or non-citizens, or if you've been adjudicated by a court as being mentally incompetent to vote, they can have a list loaded into the computers that instantly checks, is this guy eligible? Is his ID valid? And that would really do a lot to make our election day registration more secure.
Are both parties involved in mischief?
Yes. Yes.
Then why do we always lose?
I would say, well, here's the problem that we have. Do we want to live in a society where we're governed by the party that cheats the best?
No.
Because we are. I would say, yeah, some Republicans cheat and sometimes they get caught. But my experience, this is not coming from a place of partisanship. This is my God's honest observation.
Mm-hmm.
The majority of this comes from the left, especially on the industrial scale. When I was talking about the vouching fraud that was done with people wearing name tags at the polling place, American Coming Together, left-wing organization funded by George Soros, by the way. The Wellstone campaign, of course, that's a Democrat campaign. Now, I don't think the Wellstone himself was a particularly corrupt person. I think he was a very, very honest man, but he had people working for him that probably weren't, because that's part of the Democrat machine. This is just how they operate, and that's why they oppose so vehemently measures like photo ID.
Why oppose voter ID?
Well, as I say, that's the reason. The real reason is because they believe they benefit from the status quo. The scam that America Coming Together pulled with their vouchers in the polling place wouldn't work anymore if you had an ID requirement. Of course, they make excuses, but I find the excuses offensive.
What world does George Soros want? What is his end game?
Well, it appears that he wants chaos.
How would that benefit him? To become even more enriched by capitalizing it and buying up the dollar when we're in chaos?
Yeah, I think
he's already, I don't know how much money he can take.
I think there's both economic gain and political gain to be had with chaos in any country that you want to foment.
But you'd end up with a lousy country.
Well, for us, for the regular guys, for the guys that live in the gated communities and fly around in Gulf Streams, they're not going to be noticing that. They live in a whole different world.
Yeah.
So, yeah, no problem to them. They don't care what happens to us.
What if I vote for a guy? What if I've already voted for Biden and he dies between now and the election? Do I get to vote again? Well, that's part of the problem with early voting. Oh, it's a terrible problem.
The new information can come to light. Maybe a scandal. Yeah, maybe the candidate died. With early voting, once your ballot is in the system, it's counted instantly. There's no retrieving it. So if new information comes to light on election day, not all voters are voting with the same information. Basically, I see that as a problem. But another problem with early voting is we eliminate that partisan oversight. There are no citizen election judges anymore. There are no partisan or candidate poll challengers in the polling place monitoring what's going on. It's just not possible. It's too widespread to cover all those positions. So you end up with our government being in charge of counting our ballots, and that's a very un-American way to go about our democracy. Dictatorships use centralized vote counting, where they can monitor internally and control all the results. In an open democracy, our citizens do the counting and the tallying and the verifying and the observing, and we have bipartisan observation of everything's going on, so we can all say there's no shenanigans. So we agree there's no shenanigans because I was there watching and you were there watching, and we both know. And that's eliminated with
early voting. Eliminates that.
It does. Now, absentee voting is a little bit different. It used to be that if you submitted an absentee ballot and changed your mind, you could show up in the polling place and override your ballot. But that all changed after the Coleman-Franken election in 2008. Because absentee ballots were a big part of what flipped that. So they decided we're not going to count absentee ballots in the polling places anymore. We're going to centralize that. And they created these ballot boards, which is a whole nother fixing a problem that wasn't there. It creates more complexity, more opacity, and eliminates the ability in many cases for citizen oversight.
Can you stay with us?